Hey guys, tonight we venture into the documented failures of the master of mankind himself. The immortal emperor who, according to imperial records, sought to save humanity from eternal darkness. The golden god who, against the horrors of old night and the predations of chaos, forged the greatest empire the galaxy has ever known. From his emergence during the blood-soaked unification wars to his current eternal vigil upon the golden throne, his story is one of unprecedented triumph, shadowed by catastrophic miscalculation. So, before we dive into the warp, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're interested in different games lore, do visit my channel, Spartan Slumber. I've added the link in the description below. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we explore the galaxy's darkest secrets. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. Get into your blanket and let's ease into tonight's journey through the stars together. In the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, where the golden throne hums with the power of a dying god, there exists a chamber that no living soul has entered for 10,000 years. Within its walls, carved in high Gothic script that burns with inner fire, are recorded the final words spoken by the master of mankind before his entombment. Words that have never been spoken aloud since that terrible day when victory tasted like ashes and salvation felt like damnation. These words speak not of triumph, but of recognition, not of glory achieved, but of the terrible price of good intentions twisted by cosmic forces beyond mortal comprehension. They tell of a being who sought to elevate humanity to godhood, only to witness his greatest creations become the instruments of their species' eternal torment. The Emperor of Mankind stands as history's most tragic figure, a being whose every success carried within it the seeds of greater disaster. His unification of terror birthed the technologies that would later tear the galaxy apart. His creation of the Primarchs gave humanity its greatest protectors and its most terrible enemies. His Great Crusade brought enlightenment to 1,000 worlds, only to plunge them into 10 millennia of ignorance and fear. But perhaps most terrible of all, his attempt to save humanity from the darkness of superstition and religious fanaticism created the most oppressively religious civilization in galactic history. The secular paradise he envisioned became a nightmare theocracy, where his own image is worshipped by trillions of souls who live and die in his name. Tonight we examine the documented decisions that transform the galaxy's greatest savior into its unwitting destroyer. We'll trace the path from the golden dreams of the Great Crusade to the grim reality of the 41st millennium, where humanity survives only because its god-emperor's mistakes have become the pillars holding up their crumbling civilization. Imperial records show us a pattern as clear as it is heartbreaking. Every solution the Emperor implemented created problems that dwarfed the original crisis. Every victory he achieved set the stage for greater defeats. Every son he elevated to greatness became either a martyr to his cause or a monument to his failures. The Thunder Warriors he created to unite terror were purged when they outlived their usefulness, establishing a precedent of betrayal that would echo through the millennia. The Primarchs he crafted to be humanity's perfect leaders became the architects of the greatest civil war in galactic history. The imperial truth he proclaimed to free humanity from the chains of religion became the foundation for the most fanatically religious empire ever conceived. From the secret laboratories beneath the Himalayan peaks, where he dared to play with powers that existed before the first stars ignited, to the final confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit, where Father was forced to destroy his most beloved son, every chapter of his story reveals new layers of cosmic irony. But here's what makes this tale truly chilling. In the darkness between stars, where the chaos gods laugh at the follies of mortals, there are whispers that the Emperor's greatest mistake has yet to be revealed. That somewhere in the twisted calculations of a mind that has guided humanity for 40,000 years, there lies a decision so catastrophic that it makes all his previous errors seem like minor miscalculations. What could be worse than turning your most loyal son against you? What could be more devastating than watching your secular paradise become a religious nightmare? What mistake could possibly dwarf the Horus Heresy itself? The answer lies buried in imperial records so classified that their very existence is denied. Hidden in the deepest archives of the Inquisition, sealed with wards that would drive lesser minds to madness, are documents that suggest the Emperor's final gambit. A plan so desperate, so fundamentally wrong, that its implementation would make the last 10,000 years of suffering seem like a golden age of peace and prosperity. To understand how the master of mankind's greatest triumphs became humanity's most enduring curses, we must journey back to an age when terror itself was little more than a radioactive graveyard orbiting a dying star. The period imperial historians call the Age of Strife stretched across 5 millennia of darkness, from the 25th to the 30th millennium, when warp storms of unprecedented ferocity isolated human worlds across the galaxy. During this age of dissolution and horror, terror had fallen so far from its ancient glory that archaeologists of the 31st millennium would struggle to believe that this scarred wasteland had once been the birth world of human civilization. The planet's surface was a patchwork of radioactive deserts, poisoned seas, and hive cities built upon the bones of their predecessors. The sky itself was wrong, painted in hues that spoke of atmospheric damage so severe that normal sunlight had become a memory preserved only in the genetic coding of plants that would never again see natural day. This was the world that shaped the Emperor's fundamental understanding of human nature, and it was here that his first critical mistakes took root. Across Terra's devastated continents, techno-barbarian warlords ruled from fortresses carved into the husks of ancient arcologies. These petty kings commanded armies equipped with technological fragments from humanity's lost golden age, wielding plasma weapons they could maintain but no longer manufacture, riding in vehicles powered by energy sources they worshipped rather than understood. The greatest of these warlords controlled territories that might encompass entire former nations, commanding millions of subjects who lived in conditions that would have been considered intolerable even during Terra's darkest historical periods. Yet each of these tyrants saw themselves as the rightful inheritor of humanity's destiny, convinced that their brutal reign represented the first step toward reclaiming the stars. Archaeological evidence from imperial surveys conducted during the early Great Crusade reveals the true scope of humanity's fall during this period. Beneath the ruins of the techno-barbarian kingdoms lay the remnants of the dark age of technology, artifacts of such advanced design that they seemed to mock the crude weapons and desperate survival tactics of their discoverers. Standard template constructs lay broken and corroded in forgotten vaults, their memory banks corrupted by centuries of neglect and the twisted influence of warp radiation. It was into this nightmare landscape that the Emperor emerged, not as a conqueror seeking glory, but as a being who had witnessed the entire arc of human history, from its primitive beginnings to its catastrophic collapse. Imperial doctrine teaches us that he had guided humanity throughout its development, appearing at critical moments to nudge civilization along its destined path. But the terror he found during the Age of Strife was the result of that guidance taken to its logical extreme. Here lay his first fundamental error in judgment. The Emperor had observed human civilization for thousands of years, but he had never truly lived among ordinary humans as one of them. His immortality, his vast psychic power, and his accumulated knowledge had created an unbridgeable gap between his consciousness and the mortal experience. When he looked upon the techno-barbarian kings of terror, he saw crude tyrants to be swept aside. He failed to recognize that these brutal warlords were simply humans responding to impossible circumstances in the only way their evolutionary heritage allowed. The warp storms that isolated terror during this period were not merely meteorological phenomena. They were manifestations of the growing power of chaos, fed by the psychic emanations of human suffering across the galaxy. Every act of cruelty, every moment of despair, every choice to embrace darkness over light had strengthened the forces that would later corrupt the Emperor's greatest works. Yet his response to this cosmic threat revealed a mindset that would prove disastrously inadequate to the challenges ahead. Rather than seeking to understand why humanity had fallen into such darkness, the Emperor chose to impose order through superior force. Rather than addressing the spiritual void that made humans vulnerable to chaos corruption, he decided to eliminate what he perceived as the source of that vulnerability: human religion and superstition. This decision would prove to be perhaps the most catastrophic miscalculation in human history, but at the time it seemed both logical and necessary. Imperial records from this period show a being of immense confidence and unbending will, convinced that the application of sufficient force and the elimination of ignorance would solve humanity's fundamental problems. He had witnessed the rise and fall of countless civilizations, but he had never been responsible for guiding a species through a transition as profound as the one he was about to attempt. The techno-barbarian kingdoms of terror represented more than mere political entities to be conquered. They were evolutionary adaptations to impossible circumstances, social structures that had emerged from the intersection of advanced technology and primitive survival instinct. By choosing to destroy these societies rather than understanding them, the Emperor established a pattern of problem-solving that would haunt every subsequent decision he made. As he prepared to emerge from the shadows of history and claim his destiny as humanity's open leader, the Emperor carried with him 40,000 years of accumulated knowledge and a fundamental misunderstanding of the species he sought to save. His isolation from human experience had given him the perspective necessary to see humanity's potential, but it had also blinded him to the psychological and spiritual needs that made humans vulnerable to the very forces he sought to defeat. The stage was set for the Unification Wars, and with them the first in a series of victories that would carry within them the seeds of unimaginable catastrophe. The Emperor was about to transform Terra from a world of petty tyrants into the foundation of a galactic empire. But each step of this transformation would create new vulnerabilities that chaos would exploit with patience and cunning that spanned millennia. In the deepest archives of the Imperial Palace, records speak of dreams that plagued the Emperor during these final years of preparation. Dreams of golden thrones and burning worlds, of sons who would call him father, and then try to destroy everything he had built. But these were not prophecies he chose to heed. They were warnings from a future that his own decisions were already making inevitable. When the Emperor finally stepped from the shadows of anonymity to claim his destiny as Terra's undisputed master, the galaxy had already begun its slow descent toward the catastrophe that would define the next 10,000 years. The unification wars of the late 30th millennium were not simply a military campaign to bring order to a fractured world. They were the first great test of the Emperor's vision for humanity, and they revealed fundamental flaws in his character that would echo through every subsequent triumph and disaster. The techno-barbarian kingdoms that controlled Terra's scarred continents had not emerged from simple human savagery. They were sophisticated societies that had adapted to survive in conditions that would have destroyed lesser civilizations. The Indonesic bloc possessed weather-control technology that could turn entire regions into frozen wastelands. The Pan-Pacific Empire commanded biomechanical warriors whose genetic modifications made them nearly immortal. The Nordafric conclaves had mastered psychic disciplines that allowed them to communicate across continents without technological assistance. Yet, when the Emperor looked upon these achievements, he saw only obstacles to be overcome, rather than examples of human adaptability to study and incorporate. This blindness to the value of alternative approaches would become one of his most consistent and destructive patterns. Rather than seeking to understand why these societies had developed along such different paths, he dismissed them as primitive aberrations that needed to be corrected through superior force. The Thunder Warriors who spearheaded his conquest were themselves a preview of tragedies yet to come. Created in secret laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains, these superhuman soldiers combined human genetic material with techniques that would later be refined in the creation of the Primarchs. They possessed strength that could shatter ceramite armor with bare hands, reflexes that made them nearly untouchable in combat, and a fanatical loyalty to their creator that bordered on religious devotion. But the Thunder Warriors carried within their enhanced genetics a fatal flaw that the Emperor knew about from the moment of their creation. Their accelerated metabolism and enhanced aggression made them unsuitable for peacetime service. They were weapons designed for conquest, not governance, and their creator was fully aware that their usefulness would end the moment Terra was unified under his rule. This knowledge makes what followed all the more chilling. The Emperor allowed these warriors to form bonds of brotherhood with each other. He accepted their worship and gratitude. He permitted them to believe they were the first children of a new age of human greatness, all while knowing that he would eventually order their systematic elimination. The conquest of the Indonesic bloc demonstrated the Thunder Warriors' terrifying effectiveness. In a single campaign lasting less than 3 months, they dismantled a civilization that had stood for over 2 millennia. The bloc's weather control technology was destroyed rather than captured. Their libraries of accumulated knowledge were burned rather than preserved. Their population was given a simple choice that would become the template for every subsequent imperial conquest: submit completely or face extinction. But it was during the siege of the Nordafric Conclave's fortress city of Morland Sen that the Emperor's methods revealed their true character. The conclaves had offered to negotiate, recognizing his superior strength and hoping to preserve some autonomy within his growing empire. They possessed psychic disciplines that could have been invaluable to his future plans. Their understanding of the warp's dangerous currents could have prevented countless disasters in the centuries to come. Instead, the Emperor ordered the complete destruction of their psychic sanctuaries and the execution of every trained psyker among them. When questioned by his closest advisors about this seemingly wasteful slaughter, his response revealed a fundamental aspect of his character that would prove catastrophic in the ages to come. He could not tolerate the existence of any power structure that operated outside his direct control, regardless of its potential value or the loyalty it might offer. The Thunder Warriors, who carried out these massacres, began to show signs of unease that their creator chose to ignore rather than address. These superhuman soldiers had been created with enhanced empathy as well as enhanced aggression, making them capable of the brotherhood bonds that made them so effective in battle. But this same empathy made them increasingly disturbed by the systematic destruction of entire cultures and the elimination of potential allies who had offered peaceful submission. Gotha, the Thunder Warrior, who would later be remembered as the last of his kind, left records that survived in the deepest imperial archives. His accounts describe conversations with the Emperor during the final phases of the Unification Wars, conversations that reveal a being so focused on his ultimate vision that he had lost the ability to recognize the humanity of those around him. According to Gotha's testimony, the Emperor spoke of the Thunder Warriors as though they were tools whose opinions on their usage were irrelevant. When Gotha expressed concern about the destruction of the Nordafric archives, the Emperor's response was that preserving dangerous knowledge was less important than establishing the precedent that submission to his will must be absolute and unconditional. This exchange illuminates the fundamental flaw that would undermine every subsequent achievement. The Emperor had convinced himself that the ends justified any means, but he had also lost the ability to distinguish between necessary sacrifices and unnecessary cruelty. His isolation from normal human experience had created a blind spot that made him incapable of understanding how his methods affected those who served him most faithfully. The final campaign against the Caucasus wastes revealed this blindness in its most destructive form. The tribal federations of that region possessed nothing that threatened the Emperor's plans. Their technology was primitive, their population small, their territorial ambitions limited to simple survival in one of Terra's most hostile environments. They could have been absorbed into his growing empire with minimal difficulty and maximum benefit for both sides. Instead, the Emperor ordered their complete extermination as an example to any other communities that might consider resistance. The Thunder Warriors who carried out this genocide returned from the Caucasus, changed in ways that their creator either could not or chose not to recognize. They had crossed a line that separated necessary violence from meaningless slaughter, and the experience had damaged something essential in their enhanced psyches. But the Emperor's attention had already moved beyond the immediate conquest of Terra to the greater challenges that lay ahead. His alliance with the Mechanicum of Mars was taking shape, bringing with it access to technologies that would make the Great Crusade possible. The Forgers of the Red Planet were already producing the first generation of starships that would carry his armies to distant worlds. The future beckoned with promises of triumph that made the concerns of expendable warriors seem insignificant. It was during this period of transition that the Emperor began work on his greatest creation and his most catastrophic mistake. Hidden in laboratories that even his most trusted advisors were forbidden to enter, he started the experiments that would eventually produce the 20 beings who would be known as the Primarchs. But the methods he employed and the powers he chose to harness in their creation were already setting the stage for the greatest betrayal in human history: the genetic templates. He developed incorporated elements that existed beyond the boundaries of normal space and time. His research had led him into realms where the Chaos Gods held dominion, and his supreme confidence in his own abilities had convinced him that he could steal their power without risking corruption. This hubris would prove to be the foundation upon which all his subsequent failures would be built. As Terra approached complete unification under his rule, the Emperor prepared for the next phase of his grand design. The Thunder Warriors, who had served him so faithfully, were already being quietly withdrawn from active service, their questions about their future met with promises that he knew he would never keep. The stage was set for the first great betrayal of those who had trusted him completely, and with it, the establishment of a pattern that would define his reign until its catastrophic conclusion. The laboratories beneath Mount Ararat held secrets that would have driven ordinary minds to madness and despair. Within chambers carved from living rock and shielded by psychic barriers that bent reality itself, the Emperor embarked upon the most ambitious genetic engineering project in human history. The creation of the Primarchs was not merely an extension of the techniques he had used to craft the Thunder Warriors. It was a fundamental leap into territories that existed beyond the boundaries of conventional science and ventured directly into the realm where gods and demons held dominion. Imperial records from this period, classified at levels that require inquisitorial clearance to access, describe experiments that violated every principle of rational scientific method. The Emperor was not simply manipulating human genetic material. He was incorporating essences drawn from the warp itself, binding fragments of pure psychic energy into biological matrices that should have been incapable of containing such forces. The source of this otherworldly power remains one of the most closely guarded secrets in Imperial history. But fragmentary evidence suggests that the Emperor had made bargains with entities whose true nature he either misunderstood or chose to ignore. Ancient texts reference meetings that took place in spaces that existed outside normal reality, negotiations conducted with beings who spoke in concepts rather than words, and whose very presence left reality subtly altered in ways that would not become apparent until centuries later. Each of the 20 Primarch embryos represented a masterwork of impossible science. Their genetic code contained elements that could not be replicated by any technology known to exist during the 30th millennium. More disturbing still, examinations conducted by the most skilled geneticists of the Mechanicum revealed structures within their cellular architecture that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, suggesting that the Emperor had succeeded in creating beings who were as much creatures of the warp as they were products of biological evolution. But the Emperor's supreme confidence in his ability to control forces beyond mortal comprehension was about to face its first and most catastrophic test. The Chaos Gods, who had watched his experiments with growing interest, chose the moment of the Primarchs' final gestation to reveal that they had been far more aware of his activities than he had ever suspected. The assault on his laboratory complex came without warning, and from directions that should have been impossible to attack. Reality itself seemed to rebel against the Emperor's presence, as the barriers between the material universe and the warp dissolved around his greatest works. The 20 incubation chambers that contained his gene sons were caught in a maelstrom of psychic energy that transported them across the galaxy in an instant, scattering them to worlds whose locations would take centuries to discover. The Emperor's response to this disaster revealed both his greatest strength and his most fundamental weakness as a leader. Rather than acknowledging that the Chaos Gods had outmaneuvered him completely, he chose to interpret the scattering as a temporary setback that superior planning and determination could overcome. The possibility that his enemies had anticipated his every move and had been manipulating events from the beginning was too damaging to his self-image to be seriously considered. The decision to proceed with the creation of the Space Marine legions, while his genetic templates were scattered across unknown worlds, represented perhaps the single most fateful choice of his entire reign. Each legion would be built around the genetic legacy of a Primarch, whose current location, circumstances, and psychological development remained complete mysteries. Yet the Emperor convinced himself that the strength of his genetic engineering would overcome any environmental factors that might corrupt his sons during their separation from his guidance. This decision reveals a pattern of thinking that would prove disastrous in the centuries to come. The Emperor consistently underestimated the power of circumstance and environment to shape character and personality. His immortal perspective had given him a view of human nature that focused on essential qualities rather than the complex interplay between genetics and experience that actually determines individual development. The first generation of Space Marines, created from the scattered Primarch genetic material, showed capabilities that exceeded even the Emperor's most optimistic projections. These warriors possessed strength and speed that surpassed the Thunder Warriors, enhanced senses that could track targets across continents, and healing factors that could regenerate damage that would be instantly fatal to normal humans. More importantly, they demonstrated a capacity for strategic thinking and independent action that made them ideal for the galactic conquest that the Emperor was already planning. But even these early successes contained warning signs that his supreme confidence prevented him from recognizing. The Space Marines showed an almost supernatural loyalty to their creator, but this devotion came with an intensity that bordered on religious fanaticism. When the Emperor proclaimed the imperial truth and banned all forms of religious worship, his own warriors struggled to understand how their feelings toward him could be anything other than spiritual reverence for a divine being. The irony was lost on their creator, who saw only the practical benefits of commanding absolutely loyal, superhuman soldiers. The Emperor had created warriors who were psychologically incapable of betraying him, but he had also created the psychological framework that would make their eventual corruption by chaos both possible and devastating. Their capacity for absolute loyalty would become absolute hatred when turned against its original object. The search for the scattered Primarchs began almost immediately after the formation of the first Space Marine legions, but the methods employed revealed another critical flaw in the Emperor's character. Rather than conducting a systematic exploration of the galaxy to locate his missing sons, he chose to combine the search with the conquest campaigns that would eventually become known as the Great Crusade. This decision meant that each Primarch would be discovered only after their homeworld had been brought into Imperial compliance, often through military conquest that devastated the very societies that had shaped their development. The Emperor's inability to separate his role as conqueror from his role as father would have profound consequences for his relationships with his gene sons when they were finally reunited. The first successful reunion occurred when Imperial forces encountered Horus on the world of Chthoniya. The circumstances of this meeting established a template that would be repeated with tragic consistency throughout the Great Crusade. Rather than approaching Horus as a father seeking a lost son, the Emperor arrived as a conquering god demanding submission from a world that had produced one of his creations. Horus, who had spent his formative years learning to navigate the brutal politics of Chthonian gang warfare, recognized immediately that his survival depended on demonstrating absolute loyalty to this imposing figure who claimed to be his creator. But the foundation of their relationship was built on power dynamics rather than genuine affection, and this would prove to be a fatal flaw when chaos began to whisper promises of independence and recognition that the Emperor would never provide. The pattern established during Horus's discovery would be repeated with each subsequent Primarch recovery. The Emperor would arrive with overwhelming military force, demand immediate submission to his authority, and expect his gene sons to abandon everything they had learned about leadership and loyalty during their formative years. Those Primarchs who adapted quickly to this dynamic, like Horus and Guilliman, were rewarded with positions of increased responsibility. Those who struggled with the transition, like Angron and Mortarion, found themselves increasingly isolated and resentful. But perhaps most damaging of all was the Emperor's complete inability to recognize that each of his sons had been shaped by experiences that he could not fully understand or appreciate. Their homeworlds had taught them lessons about leadership, sacrifice, and the nature of power that differed fundamentally from his own perspective. Rather than seeing these differences as valuable additions to his own knowledge, he viewed them as flaws that needed to be corrected through proper guidance and discipline. The stage was being set for the greatest family tragedy in galactic history, but the Emperor's attention was already focused on the grander vision of human unity that he believed would make all individual concerns irrelevant. The Great Crusade was about to begin, and with it, the period of expansion and triumph that would blind him to the growing resentment and confusion among the very sons he had created to be humanity's perfect protectors. The launch of the Great Crusade in 798.M30 represented humanity's greatest moment of unified purpose and unlimited ambition. From the orbital shipyards of Mars to the gene laboratories of Terra, the Emperor's vision of a secular, rational galaxy seemed within reach for the first time since the collapse of the Dark Age of technology. Yet even as Imperial fleets prepared to reclaim the stars that humanity had lost to warp storms and alien predation, the very foundations of this golden age contained flaws so fundamental that they would eventually transform triumph into catastrophe. The imperial truth that the Emperor proclaimed as the philosophical cornerstone of his new civilization was built upon a lie so audacious that it defied belief While publicly denying the existence of gods and supernatural forces, the Emperor himself was the most powerful psyker in galactic history, a being whose abilities were so far beyond normal human capacity that they could only be described as divine. More damaging still, his private knowledge of chaos and the warp was comprehensive and detailed, making his public dismissal of these threats an act of deliberate deception rather than simple ignorance. This contradiction at the heart of imperial doctrine created vulnerabilities that the Chaos Gods would exploit with patience and cunning that spanned millennia. By teaching humanity that gods were mere superstition while secretly struggling against entities whose power rivaled his own, the Emperor left his people spiritually defenseless against forces they had been trained not to recognize or resist. The reunion with each lost Primarch brought new capabilities to the growing imperial war machine, but also introduced personality conflicts and philosophical differences that the Emperor consistently chose to ignore rather than address. Angron's arrival on the world of Nikaea provided perhaps the clearest example of his inability to understand the psychological needs of his own creations. The Primarch of the World Eaters had been discovered fighting as a gladiator slave, leading a desperate rebellion against masters who had tortured him since childhood. The butcher's nails implanted in his brain were primitive cybernetic devices that enhanced his combat abilities while causing him constant, agonizing pain. When Imperial forces arrived to claim him, they found Angron making his final stand alongside the only family he had ever known, preparing to die with the fellow slaves who had shared his suffering and his dream of freedom. The Emperor's response to this situation revealed a coldness that his other sons would remember and fear for the rest of their lives. Rather than allowing Angron to die honorably with his chosen brothers, the Emperor teleported him directly to his flagship, leaving the gladiator army to be slaughtered without their leader. The message was clear to any Primarch intelligent enough to understand it. Their personal attachments and individual desires were irrelevant compared to their function as tools of imperial expansion. Worse still, the Emperor made no attempt to remove or alleviate the butcher's nails, despite possessing technology that could have easily eliminated the devices. When questioned about this decision, he explained that the nails were integral to Angron's combat effectiveness, and that removing them might reduce his value as a military asset. The implications of this choice would haunt the World Eaters' Legion for centuries, as the nails' corrupting influence spread through their ranks and eventually made them vulnerable to Khorne's whispered promises of eternal warfare. The reunion with Conrad Kersey on Nostromo revealed another facet of the Emperor's willful blindness to the psychological damage his methods inflicted. The Night Haunter had spent his formative years as a vigilante killer, using terror tactics to impose order on a world consumed by crime and corruption. His methods were brutal beyond description, but they had achieved results that more conventional approaches had failed to produce. Rather than attempting to understand why Kurz had developed such extreme methods, or exploring whether his techniques might be adapted for less destructive purposes, the Emperor simply accepted the Night Haunter's effectiveness and deployed him wherever maximum terror was required. The psychological isolation this created drove Kurz deeper into the madness that would eventually consume him entirely. But perhaps the most catastrophic reunion occurred when Imperial forces rediscovered Mortarion on the plague world of Barbarous. The Primarch had spent decades fighting to liberate his adopted people from alien tyrants who ruled through toxic sorcery and biological warfare. He was on the verge of achieving his lifelong goal when the Emperor arrived and demanded that he submit to Imperial authority immediately. The ultimatum that followed would poison the relationship between father and son for eternity. The Emperor offered to defeat Mortarion's final enemy if the Primarch agreed to serve in the Great Crusade, but if Mortarion could overcome this last tyrant himself, he would be free to remain on Barbarous and rule his people as he saw fit. The challenge seemed reasonable, but it was designed to demonstrate the Emperor's superiority rather than respect Mortarion's capabilities. When Mortarion attempted the final assault on the tyrant's poisonous mountain fortress, he was overcome by toxins that his enhanced physiology could not process. The Emperor rescued him at the moment of defeat, completed the mission Mortarion had failed to finish, and then claimed the promised service as though it had been fairly won. The humiliation and resentment this created would eventually drive Mortarion into the embrace of Nurgle, the chaos god whose gifts would transform the Death Guard into harbingers of galactic plague. The pattern repeated itself with tragic consistency throughout the Great Crusade's early years. Lorgar was discovered on Colchis, where he had spent his youth preaching religious devotion and building magnificent temple cities dedicated to the worship of divine beings. Rather than recognizing the positive aspects of Lorgar's spiritual leadership and finding ways to channel his gifts constructively, the Emperor simply demanded that he abandon his religious beliefs and embrace the secular rationalism of the imperial truth. The word-bearer's desperate attempts to transfer his religious devotion to the Emperor himself were met with increasingly harsh rejection, culminating in the destruction of Monarchia and the public humiliation of the entire word-bearer's legion. This moment of absolute rejection would eventually drive Lorgar to seek out the very gods the Emperor denied, leading to the discovery of chaos and the corruption that would tear the galaxy apart. Yet even as these warning signs accumulated, the Emperor's attention remained focused on the spectacular successes of the Great Crusade. Hundreds of worlds were brought into compliance each year. Long-lost human civilizations were reunited with their species. Ancient enemies were defeated and forgotten technologies were recovered. The dream of a unified human galaxy seemed more achievable with each passing campaign. The Space Marine legions had evolved into military forces of unprecedented effectiveness. The Lunar Wolves under Horus had perfected rapid strike tactics that could bring entire systems into compliance within weeks. The Ultramarines under Guilliman had developed administrative methods that could integrate conquered worlds into Imperial society with remarkable efficiency. The Imperial Fists under Dawn had mastered defensive strategies that made Imperial worlds nearly impregnable once they had been fortified. But beneath these successes, fundamental problems were growing that the Emperor either could not or chose not to recognize. The Imperial truth had created a spiritual vacuum that left human populations vulnerable to exactly the kind of corruption the doctrine was meant to prevent. The harsh treatment of the Primarchs was breeding resentment that would eventually explode into open rebellion. The Emperor's increasing withdrawal from direct involvement in the Crusade was creating leadership vacuum that ambitious enemies would exploit. Most dangerous of all, the success of the Great Crusade had convinced the Emperor that his methods were fundamentally correct, and that any problems that arose were simply minor obstacles that superior force and determination could overcome. This supreme confidence would blind him to the greatest threat, his empire would ever face, even as that threat grew stronger, with each world brought into imperial compliance, and each son driven toward the breaking point by his inflexible demands for absolute obedience. As the Great Crusade reached its zenith during the early decades of the 31st millennium, the Emperor's vision of human unity appeared to be transforming from impossible dream into inevitable reality. Fleet after fleet departed Terra, carrying the banner of imperial expansion to worlds that had languished in isolation since the collapse of the dark age of technology. Yet beneath this facade of triumph, philosophical divisions between the Primarchs were deepening into chasms that would eventually tear the galaxy apart. Each reunion with a lost Primarch brought unique capabilities to the imperial war machine, but also introduced perspectives on leadership and warfare that often conflicted fundamentally with the Emperor's rigid vision of secular rationalism. These differences might have been sources of strength, bringing diverse approaches to the challenges of galactic conquest. Instead, the Emperor's inflexibility and growing distance from his sons transformed natural variation into dangerous resentment. Guilliman's reunion on Macragga demonstrated both the potential benefits and hidden costs of the Emperor's approach to leadership. The Primarch of the Ultramarines had spent his formative years learning statecraft from Connor Guilliman, a ruler whose wisdom and compassion had transformed a single city-state into a thriving civilization that spanned continents. When imperial forces arrived, they found not a primitive world awaiting enlightenment, but a sophisticated society whose governmental structures rivaled anything the Imperium had developed. Rather than studying Macragg's successful integration of military efficiency with civilian prosperity, the Emperor simply incorporated Guilliman's world into the imperial structure and moved on to the next conquest. The subtle message was clear to any Primarch intelligent enough to perceive it. Their pre-imperial achievements were irrelevant compared to their potential service to his greater vision. This pattern reached its most destructive expression in the relationship between the Emperor and Magnus the Red, the Primarch, whose psychic abilities most closely resembled his own. The reunion on Prospero should have marked the beginning of a collaboration between the two most powerful psykers in human history. Instead, it became the foundation for one of the most tragic betrayals in the annals of imperial history. Magnus had transformed Prospero into a paradise of learning, where knowledge was valued above material wealth and scholarly achievement was the highest form of honor. The planet's libraries contained philosophical and scientific works that predated the Age of Strife, preserved through careful stewardship, while the rest of humanity struggled simply to survive. More importantly, Magnus had developed techniques for safely accessing the warp's vast reservoirs of knowledge without falling prey to the corruption that had destroyed so many previous psychic civilizations. The Emperor's response to these achievements revealed a jealousy and insecurity that he would never publicly acknowledge. Rather than recognizing Magnus as a potential equal whose different approach to psychic mastery might complement his own techniques, the Emperor saw only a rival whose independent success challenged his unique status as humanity's psychic guardian. The growing tension between father and son manifested itself most clearly in their disagreements about the proper role of psychic powers within imperial society. Magnus argued that denying humanity's psychic potential would leave the species vulnerable to exactly the kind of warp-based threats that the imperial truth claimed did not exist. His warnings about chaos corruption were based on direct observation of entities and phenomena that the emperor knew to be absolutely real and dangerously powerful. Yet, instead of acknowledging the validity of Magnus's concerns, the emperor chose to intensify his public denial of warp-based threats while privately increasing his own psychic research and development. This hypocrisy created a fundamental breach of trust that would eventually drive Magnus to seek the very knowledge that his father forbade, making him vulnerable to exactly the kind of corruption that proper education might have prevented. The philosophical divide reached its breaking point during the Council of Nikaea in 001.M31, an assembly that would rank among the most catastrophic decisions in Imperial history. Representatives from across the galaxy gathered to debate the proper role of psychic powers within human civilization. But the Emperor had already decided the outcome before the first speaker took the podium. Magnus's impassioned defense of psychic development was met with testimony from witnesses who described the devastating effects of uncontrolled warp phenomena on human populations. But rather than using this evidence to develop better training and safety protocols, the Emperor chose to ban all forms of psychic development except those under his direct supervision. The Edict of Nikaea that emerged from this assembly represented perhaps the greatest single act of hypocrisy in recorded human history. The most powerful psyker who had ever existed issued absolute prohibition against the development of psychic abilities, while continuing to expand his own capabilities and those of his chosen servants. The contradiction was so blatant that even the most loyal Primarchs began to question whether their father was still capable of rational judgment. For Magnus, the edict represented not just a rejection of his life's work, but a betrayal of everything he had believed about his relationship with the Emperor. The bitter irony was that his loyalty to his father made him more vulnerable to corruption, not less. His desperate attempts to prove that psychic powers could be used safely and responsibly led him to take increasingly dangerous risks that would eventually provide chaos with the opening it needed to destroy everything he cherished. The Emperor's withdrawal from direct involvement in the Great Crusade compounded these growing problems by creating a leadership vacuum that Horus was expected to fill without adequate preparation or authority. The decision to name Horus as War Master, while the Emperor returned to Terra on undefined business, sent a clear message to the other Primarchs about their relative value in their father's estimation. The selection of Horus over potentially superior candidates like Guilliman or Dawn was based primarily on personal favoritism rather than objective qualifications for supreme command. This choice created resentment among Primarchs whose military achievements equaled or exceeded those of their newly elevated brother. More dangerous still, it placed the burden of galaxy-wide coordination on a Primarch whose skills were better suited to leading from the front than managing complex political relationships. Horus's growing frustration with the administrative demands of supreme command was exacerbated by the Emperor's complete refusal to explain why his presence on Terra had become so urgently necessary. The Webway Project remained hidden even from the designated heir to Imperial leadership, creating a sense of exclusion and betrayal that chaos would exploit with devastating effectiveness. The increasing bureaucratization of imperial administration during this period reflected the Emperor's fundamental misunderstanding of human motivation and social organization. Rather than building systems that acknowledge the complexity of governing a galaxy-spanning civilization, he created rigid hierarchies that demanded absolute obedience without providing adequate explanation or justification for imperial policies. Local commanders who attempted to adapt imperial doctrine to unique planetary conditions found themselves subjected to inquisitorial investigation. Planetary governors who showed initiative in solving problems that Terra was too distant to address properly were replaced with more compliant administrators. The message was clear throughout the expanding Imperium. Innovation and independent thinking were treated as forms of disloyalty that would be punished regardless of their practical benefits. This atmosphere of suspicion and rigid conformity created exactly the kind of spiritual vacuum that chaos corruption thrived upon. Humans who were denied meaningful participation in shaping their own destiny became vulnerable to whispered promises of power and recognition from entities that offered everything the imperial system withheld. The stage was being set for the greatest tragedy in human history, but the Emperor's attention remained focused on his secret project beneath the imperial palace. The golden dream of human unity was about to become a nightmare of civil war and corruption, initiated not by external enemies but by the very sons he had created to be humanity's perfect protectors. The Emperor's withdrawal to Terra in the closing years of the Great Crusade marked the beginning of the end for his grand vision of human unity. What imperial records describe as a temporary reassignment to handle urgent administrative matters was actually the commencement of the most secretive and potentially devastating project in human history. The construction of the Webway Gate beneath the imperial palace would consume the Emperor's attention so completely that he became blind to the corruption spreading throughout his own ranks. The decision to conceal the Webway Project, even from his most trusted sons, represented a fundamental failure of leadership that would have catastrophic consequences. Horus, newly elevated to the position of War Master, found himself expected to coordinate the galaxy's conquest while being denied access to information that was essential to understanding imperial strategic objectives. The other Primarchs, already struggling with their father's emotional distance, interpreted this secrecy as evidence that they had lost whatever trust and affection he had once shown them. But the Emperor's isolation went beyond mere physical absence from the Crusade fleets. His consciousness had become so focused on the technical challenges of bridging real space and the Webway that he lost awareness of the psychological and spiritual needs of those who served him most faithfully. The being who had once claimed to understand human nature better than humanity itself had become so divorced from normal emotional experience that he could no longer recognize the warning signs of impending betrayal. The first systematic infiltration of chaos corruption began not with the Primarchs, but with the chaplains and spiritual advisors who served the Space Marine legions. Erebus of the word bearers and Cor Ferron of the same legion had never truly accepted the imperial truth's denial of divine power. Their religious devotion had simply transferred from the gods of Colchis to what they perceived as the divine emperor. But when that devotion was rejected and humiliated at Monarchia, it left them vulnerable to whispered promises from entities whose existence the imperial truth denied. The pilgrimage to the Eye of Terror that followed Monarchia's destruction was presented to Lorgar as a quest for understanding rather than an act of rebellion against imperial doctrine. The word bearers who accompanied their Primarch into that realm of pure chaos believed they were seeking truth that had been hidden from them by their father's secular prejudices. Instead, they discovered powers that offered everything the Emperor had denied them: recognition, purpose, and the promise that their spiritual devotion was not mere superstition, but insight into fundamental cosmic truth. The corruption that took root during this pilgrimage was subtle and patient, spreading through the word-bearer's legion over decades, rather than manifesting immediately as obvious heresy. Erebus and his co-conspirators understood that premature revelation of their newfound allegiances would result in swift suppression by loyal imperial forces. Instead, they began the careful work of identifying potential sympathizers among the other legions, focusing particularly on those Primarchs whose relationships with the Emperor had been damaged by his harsh treatment or inexplicable neglect. The Emperor's intelligence networks, despite their galaxy-spanning scope and sophisticated surveillance capabilities, completely failed to detect this corruption because they were designed to identify external threats rather than internal rebellion. The possibility that his own sons might turn against him was so fundamentally incompatible with his understanding of their genetic programming and psychological conditioning that he had created no safeguards against such a betrayal. This blindness to internal threats became tragically apparent in his response to Magnus's attempts to warn him about Horus's corruption. When the Primarch of the Thousand Suns detected chaos influence affecting the War Master through his psychic investigations, he faced an impossible choice between violating the Edict of Nikaea and allowing the corruption to proceed undetected. Magnus's decision to use forbidden sorcery to pierce the psychic barriers, protecting the Emperor's secret project, was motivated by loyalty so absolute that he was willing to risk his own destruction to deliver vital intelligence to his father. The psychic message he attempted to transmit contained information that could have prevented the Horus Heresy entirely, identifying not only the War Master's corruption, but also the broader conspiracy that was spreading through multiple legions. Instead, Magnus's warning became the catalyst for one of the Emperor's most devastating mistakes. The psychic breach that accompanied the message caused catastrophic damage to the Webway Project, destroying centuries of careful construction and unleashing demonic incursions that would plague Terra for the next 10,000 years. Rather than recognizing the loyal intent behind Magnus's actions, the Emperor interpreted the destruction as evidence that his son had deliberately betrayed him. The Emperor's rage at this moment represented perhaps the most human emotion he had displayed since the beginning of the Great Crusade, but it was also the emotion that blinded him to the truth of what had actually occurred. His fury at seeing his greatest work destroyed overwhelmed his ability to analyze the situation rationally, leading to decisions that would transform one of his most loyal sons into one of his greatest enemies. The dispatch of Lemon Russ and the Space Wolves to bring Magnus to Terra for censure represented a failure of judgment so profound that its consequences continue to echo through Imperial history. Rather than attempting to understand why Magnus had violated the Edict of Nikaea, the Emperor chose to treat the incident as simple disobedience that required immediate and harsh punishment. The instructions given to Russ were deliberately ambiguous, allowing the Wolf King to interpret his mission as either capture or execution, depending on the circumstances he encountered. This deliberate vagueness was intended to give the Emperor plausible deniability, regardless of the outcome. But it also ensured that the confrontation on Prospero would be as destructive as possible. The burning of Prospero and the devastation of the Thousand Sons Legion eliminated one of the Imperium's most valuable military assets and drove a powerful psychic Primarch directly into the embrace of the very chaos forces the Emperor was struggling to contain. The irony was so complete that it might have been orchestrated by the chaos gods themselves, and indeed, later evidence would suggest that Sench had been manipulating events to ensure exactly this outcome. But even more damaging than the immediate military consequences was the message the Emperor's actions sent to his remaining loyal sons. The destruction of Prospero demonstrated that even the most faithful service provided no protection against imperial wrath, if circumstances could be interpreted as disobedience. Primarchs who had previously trusted their father's judgment began to question whether their own loyalty might someday be rewarded with similar betrayal. The growing atmosphere of suspicion and fear among the Primarchs created exactly the psychological conditions that chaos corruption required to spread from the initial word-bearer infection to the broader rebellion that would soon consume the galaxy. Sons who might have resisted whispered promises of power and independence found themselves vulnerable to suggestions that their father had already abandoned them and that their survival depended on taking decisive action to protect themselves and their legions. The Emperor, trapped in his subterranean laboratory by the constant daemon incursions that Magnus's warning had unleashed, remained unaware that his harsh response to one son's loyalty had set in motion the very rebellion he feared most. The golden age of the Great Crusade was ending, but rather than concluding in triumph as he had envisioned, it was collapsing into the greatest civil war in human history, initiated and sustained by the very methods he had used to build his empire. The corruption of Horus began not with grand gestures of rebellion, but with a single moment of vulnerability on a forgotten world at the edge of imperial space. The War Master's wounding during the campaign against the Eurasian technocracy should have been a minor incident in the broader scope of the Great Crusade. Instead, it became the pivot point upon which the fate of the galaxy would turn, transforming humanity's greatest protector into the architect of its most devastating civil war. The events on Devon revealed the Emperor's most catastrophic failure as both father and strategist. His complete absence during Horus's moment of greatest need was not simply poor timing, but the inevitable consequence of priorities that placed abstract projects above personal relationships. While the War Master lay dying from wounds that conventional medicine could not heal, the Emperor remained sealed in his laboratory beneath Terra, so consumed by the Webway Project that he was unaware his most favored son was fighting for his life. The decision to accept healing from the Serpent Lodge represented Horus's first step toward damnation, but it was a choice born from desperation rather than deliberate treachery. The Lodge's priests possessed knowledge of biological restoration that Imperial technology could not match, offering recovery at a price that seemed insignificant compared to the alternative of death. The chaos corruption that accompanied their treatment was subtle and patient, working through dreams and visions rather than obvious compulsion. In the fever dreams that followed his healing, Horus experienced visions of futures that seemed to reveal the Emperor's true intentions for the galaxy and for his son. These visions, crafted by entities whose understanding of human psychology spanned millions of years, showed the Emperor as a deity who intended to abandon his Primarchs once their usefulness had ended, just as he had abandoned the Thunder Warriors after Terra's unification. The terrifying aspect of these chaos-induced revelations was that they contained enough truth to be believable. The emperor had indeed discarded faithful servants when they were no longer needed. He had concealed his divine nature while demanding absolute loyalty from beings he refused to trust with complete knowledge of his plans. He had withdrawn from the Great Crusade at its moment of greatest triumph, leaving his sons to wonder whether their sacrifices meant anything to him beyond their tactical value. Horus's transformation, upon awakening from his healing trance, was so gradual that even his closest advisors initially attributed the changes to the trauma of his near-death experience. His growing cynicism about imperial doctrine seemed like natural evolution in a leader who had seen the galaxy's true complexity. His increasing criticism of the emperor's methods appeared to be the mature perspective of a commander who had learned harsh lessons about the costs of galactic conquest. But beneath this facade of reasonable development, something fundamental had changed in the War Master's psyche. The absolute loyalty that had once defined his relationship with the Emperor had been replaced by a burning resentment that fed on every perceived slight and every moment of paternal neglect. The love he had once felt for his father had transformed into hatred so intense that it required constant effort to conceal from those who might report his changed attitudes to terror. The recruitment of other Primarchs to his cause revealed Horus's retained strategic brilliance, now turned toward the most destructive possible purpose. Rather than attempting to convert his brothers through ideological arguments, he identified those whose relationships with the Emperor had been most damaged by imperial policies and offered them something their father had consistently denied: recognition of their individual worth and acknowledgement of their legitimate grievances. Fulgrim's recruitment was accomplished through appeals to his artistic sensibilities and his growing frustration with the Emperor's utilitarian approach to human achievement. The Phoenix Guard was offered visions of perfection that transcended the crude efficiency that imperial doctrine valued above all other considerations. The promise that he could create beauty worthy of his enhanced capabilities proved more seductive than any political argument could have been. Angron's conversion required no seduction whatsoever. The Primarch of the World Eaters had never forgiven the Emperor for abandoning his gladiator brothers to die on Nuceria, and the constant pain of the butcher's nails had only intensified his rage over the intervening decades. When Horus offered him the opportunity to inflict upon the Emperor the same kind of loss and betrayal he had experienced, Angron's acceptance was immediate and enthusiastic. Mortarion's recruitment appealed to his deep-seated resentment over the humiliation he had suffered during his reunion with the Emperor. The promise that he would never again be forced to accept rescue from a crisis he could have solved himself resonated with pride that had been festering since his discovery on Barbarous. The Death Guard's Primarch saw rebellion not as betrayal but as the assertion of dignity that his father had systematically denied him. The most tragic recruitment was that of Prospero, whose loyalty had never wavered despite decades of being assigned the Great Crusade's most thankless and destructive tasks. The Iron Warriors had borne the burden of siege warfare that other legions considered beneath their dignity, grinding through campaigns that offered no glory and little recognition. When Horus offered Prospero the respect and acknowledgement that the Emperor had consistently withheld, the master of fortification found the temptation impossible to resist. The virus bombing of Istvan III marked the point of no return for the rebellion, transforming what might have remained a political dispute into genocidal civil war. The systematic murder of loyalist space marines by their own battle brothers, shattered bonds of brotherhood that had been forged through centuries of shared struggle. More importantly, it demonstrated that the traitor Primarchs were willing to commit atrocities that exceeded anything in the previous history of human warfare. The Emperor's response to intelligence reports about Istvan III's revealed his continued inability to comprehend the scope of the threat he faced. Rather than recognizing the virus bombing as evidence of systematic chaos corruption, he interpreted it as a political rebellion that could be contained through superior force and strategic maneuvering. This fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy's nature and objectives would handicap Imperial responses throughout the conflict that followed. The dispatch of 7 loyalist legions to Istvan Vir was intended as a demonstration of overwhelming Imperial might that would crush the rebellion before it could spread to other systems. Instead, it became the greatest military disaster in Imperial history, as 4 of the 7 legions revealed their own corruption by turning their weapons on their loyal brothers at the moment of supposed victory. The drop site massacre eliminated 3 entire Space Marine legions and crippled a 4th, destroying military assets that had taken centuries to develop and could never be replaced. More devastating still was the psychological impact on surviving loyalists, who now understood that any of their brothers might be secret traitors waiting for the optimal moment to strike. The Emperor's strategic failures during this period stemmed from his continued reliance on methods that had been effective against external enemies, but were catastrophically inadequate against internal corruption. His decision to send Lemon Russ against Magnus rather than supporting the Thousand Sons against Chaos Influence eliminated one of his most powerful psychic allies at the moment when such capabilities were most desperately needed. The burning of Prospero represented perhaps the single most self-destructive action in Imperial military history, transforming a loyal legion into sworn enemies while simultaneously depriving Imperial forces of capabilities that would have been invaluable in the struggle against chaos sorcery. The irony that the Emperor's harsh response to Magnus's warning had eliminated the very assets needed to fight the threat Magnus had tried to prevent was lost on no one except the Emperor himself. As Horus's rebellion gathered momentum and spread to systems across the galaxy, the Emperor remained trapped in his laboratory beneath Terra, fighting a continuous battle against daemon incursions, while his empire collapsed around him. The golden dream of human unity was becoming a nightmare of fratricidal war, and the being who had orchestrated humanity's greatest triumph was discovering that his methods of control were powerless against enemies who offered his followers everything he had denied them. The approach of Horus's armada to the Sol system forced the Emperor into the most desperate period of his existence since the Age of Strife. For the first time in 40 millennia, he faced the possibility of absolute defeat at the hands of enemies who possessed intimate knowledge of every strength and weakness in his defenses. The corrupt Primarchs advancing on Terra were not external invaders learning Imperial capabilities through trial and error, but his own sons who had helped design the very systems they now sought to destroy. The Emperor's response to this unprecedented crisis revealed both his capacity for pragmatic adaptation and his fundamental inability to acknowledge the role his own decisions had played in creating the catastrophe he now faced. Rather than recognizing that his harsh treatment of his sons had driven them to rebellion, he interpreted their betrayal as evidence that he had been insufficiently ruthless in maintaining control over potential threats to imperial unity. The activation of forbidden technologies that had been sealed away since the Unification Wars represented the first in a series of increasingly desperate compromises with the principles that had supposedly guided imperial expansion. Weapons that the Emperor had deemed too dangerous for use against external enemies were now deployed in defense of Terra itself, including devices whose operation required the sacrifice of human psykers on a scale that dwarfed even the Golden Throne's enormous appetite for psychic energy. The recruitment of forces that imperial doctrine had previously classified as heretical demonstrated how completely the crisis had undermined the Emperor's commitment to the secular rationalism he had proclaimed as humanity's salvation. Techno-barbarian survivors who had been driven into Terra's deepest underground refuges were offered pardons and positions in exchange for their knowledge of pre-imperial defensive systems. Religious cults that had maintained secret worship despite centuries of imperial persecution were given tacit approval to practice their rituals, if those rituals could contribute to Terra's defense. Most damaging to the Emperor's long-term credibility was his recruitment of psykers whose abilities had been developed through exactly the kind of warp-based research that the Edict of Nikaea had forbidden. These individuals possessed capabilities that conventional imperial psykers could not match, having learned their techniques through communion with warp entities that imperial doctrine insisted did not exist. Their effectiveness in combat against chaos forces proved that the Emperor's prohibition of such research had been strategically catastrophic, depriving imperial forces of tools that were essential for fighting enemies who used similar methods without restraint. But perhaps the most telling aspect of the Emperor's desperate innovations was his willingness to employ chaos-tainted artifacts and technologies that his forces had captured from traitor legions. Weapons that had been blessed by daemon princes were purified through imperial rituals and distributed to loyalist defenders. Battle gear that bore the marks of chaos corruption was deemed acceptable for use as long as its wielders maintained sufficient faith in the imperial cause. This pragmatic embrace of corrupted tools revealed the fundamental bankruptcy of the imperial truth's claim that chaos could be defeated through pure reason and secular enlightenment. The Emperor was now acknowledging, through his actions if not his words, that fighting chaos required methods that were indistinguishable from those used by his enemies. The only difference between imperial and traitor forces was their stated loyalty to competing visions of human destiny, not their willingness to employ warp-based power for tactical advantage. The diplomatic initiatives launched during this period represented perhaps the most tragic aspect of the entire crisis. Despite overwhelming evidence that his corrupted sons were beyond any possibility of reconciliation, the Emperor continued to believe that superior arguments and generous offers could restore their loyalty to his cause. These attempts at negotiation revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what chaos corruption actually entailed and how completely it had transformed the Primarchs he had once loved as his greatest achievements. The communications sent to Horus in the weeks before the siege of Terra began contained promises that the Emperor had never made during the centuries when such gestures might have prevented the rebellion entirely. offers of increased autonomy for the Space Marine legions, acknowledgement of the Primarchs as equals rather than subordinates, and even hints that the imperial truth might be modified to accommodate different philosophical perspectives, all arrived far too late to matter to beings whose hatred had been refined through years of chaos indoctrination. Mortarion's response to one such overture, preserved in the deepest imperial archives, revealed the complete futility of the Emperor's diplomatic efforts. The Primarch of the Death Guard wrote that he could no longer remember why he had ever loved the being who claimed to be his father, and that the gifts Nurgle had provided had proven far more valuable than anything he had received during his centuries of imperial service. The corruption had not simply changed his allegiances, it had fundamentally altered his capacity for the emotions that had once bound him to his creator. The most heartbreaking of these failed reconciliation attempts involved Magnus the Red, whose psychic abilities would have been invaluable in defending Terra against the sorcerous assaults that were certain to accompany Horus's invasion. The Emperor's messages to his lost son contained acknowledgments of error and expressions of regret that had been absent from their previous communications, but they arrived after Magnus had already accepted Tzeentch's patronage and begun his transformation into something that was no longer entirely human. Magnus's final response, delivered through a daemon-possessed astropath who died screaming as the message concluded, contained a level of bitterness that shocked even the Emperor's emotionally hardened psyche. The Crimson King explained that he had spent centuries seeking his father's approval and recognition, only to receive both in the form of a desperate plea for help from a being who was about to lose everything he had worked to build. The irony that the Emperor was now offering freely what he had previously withheld was not lost on his most intellectually gifted son. The contingency plans developed during this period for the potential collapse of imperial resistance revealed the Emperor's growing understanding that his survival might not be sufficient to preserve the civilization he had created. Documents classified at levels requiring joint authorization from the High Lords of Terra and the Fabricator General of Mars describe procedures for maintaining essential imperial functions in the event of catastrophic leadership failure. These plans contained provisions for the systematic destruction of critical infrastructure to prevent its capture by chaos forces, the evacuation of essential personnel to hidden redoubts throughout the galaxy, and the establishment of successor organizations that could continue imperial resistance even if Terra itself fell to the traitors. The most disturbing aspect of these contingencies was their implicit acknowledgement that the Emperor's methods of governance had created a system so dependent on his personal oversight that his death or incapacitation would likely result in immediate civilizational collapse. The preparation of these documents forced the Emperor to confront the possibility that his greatest mistake had not been any specific decision about his sons or his policies, but his fundamental approach to leadership itself. By concentrating so much power and knowledge in his own person, he had created an empire that could not survive his absence. The irony that his attempt to protect humanity by assuming complete control had made the species more vulnerable than it had been during the chaos of the Age of Strife was becoming impossible to ignore. But even as he prepared for potential defeat, the Emperor continued to believe that sufficient determination and superior planning could overcome any obstacle, including the rebellion of his own sons. This faith in his ultimate victory would drive him to make the final series of decisions that would transform Pyrrhic triumph into eternal torment, ensuring that his survival would become a curse that would haunt humanity for 10,000 years. The arrival of Horus's armada in the Sol system marked the moment when the Emperor's accumulated mistakes across 4 decades of galactic conquest finally converged into a single, overwhelming catastrophe. The sight of Space Marine battle barges bearing the twisted heraldry of corrupted legions filled the void where loyal fleets should have stood guard. Sons who had once knelt in reverence now approached terror with weapons charged and murder in their enhanced hearts. The Emperor's first glimpse of the War Master's fleet through the palace's orbital sensors revealed the true scope of his failure as both military strategist and father. These were not rebellious children acting out against parental authority, but transformed beings whose corruption had advanced so far that they barely retained recognizable human characteristics. The ships themselves had been twisted into configurations that hurt to perceive directly, their hulls inscribed with symbols that caused madness in unprotected observers. But perhaps most devastating of all was the Emperor's recognition that this armada represented the culmination of his own strategic choices rather than an external invasion that could be repelled through superior force. Every weapon system approaching terror had been designed with his approval. Every tactical doctrine being employed against Imperial defenses had been developed under his guidance. Every corrupted Space Marine leading the assault had been created using his genetic template and trained according to his specifications. The psychological impact of fighting his own children proved far more damaging than the Emperor had anticipated. His initial battle orders revealed a hesitation that bordered on tactical paralysis as he struggled to adapt strategies designed for use against external enemies to a conflict where victory required the systematic destruction of beings he had once cherished as his greatest achievements. The delay caused by this emotional turmoil allowed Chaos forces to establish positions that might have been denied through immediate, decisive action. The traitor Primarchs' approach to the siege revealed how completely their corruption had transformed their understanding of warfare itself. Rather than seeking swift conquest through conventional military means, they employed tactics specifically designed to maximize psychological trauma among Imperial defenders. Civilian populations were tortured in full view of palace battlements. Captured loyalists were transformed into daemon hosts and sent against their former brothers. Every engagement was crafted to demonstrate that mercy and honor had become weaknesses that would be ruthlessly exploited. The Emperor's continued entrapment within the palace's deepest levels, maintaining the psychic barriers that prevented demonic invasion through the shattered Webway Gate, created a command crisis that loyal forces were unprepared to address. Rogel Dawn assumed tactical control of Terra's defense, but he lacked both the authority and the comprehensive understanding of Imperial capabilities needed to coordinate resistance on the required scale. The resulting fragmentation of command allowed traitor forces to achieve breakthrough after breakthrough that unified leadership might have prevented. The most painful aspect of this period was the Emperor's growing realization that each of his corrupted sons retained enough of their original personality to make their betrayal personally devastating rather than simply tactically challenging. When Fulgrim's forces broke through the Saturnine Gate, the Phoenix Lord's transmitted taunts contained references to private conversations and shared moments that only a beloved son could have known. The corruption had not erased these memories, but had transformed them into weapons specifically designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. Angron's assault on the Eternity Wall spaceport demonstrated how completely the Emperor's harsh treatment of his sons had poisoned their capacity for filial loyalty. The Primarch of the World Eaters fought with a fury that exceeded even his usual berserker rage, driven not just by the butcher's nails, but by decades of accumulated resentment over his father's abandonment of his gladiator brothers on Nuceria. Every swing of his daemon-touched axes carried the weight of a grievance that had been festering since the moment of his discovery. The siege's progression revealed tactical patterns that should have been impossible for enemies operating without inside knowledge of Imperial defensive systems. Traitor forces consistently targeted weak points that were known only to a handful of palace architects and high-ranking military commanders. Supply routes that had been classified at the highest levels of Imperial security were interdicted with precision that suggested detailed intelligence about their locations and schedules. The Emperor's investigation into these security breaches uncovered evidence of corruption that reached into the highest levels of Imperial administration. Trusted advisors who had served faithfully for centuries revealed themselves as long-term infiltrators whose loyalty to chaos predated the rebellion itself. The discovery that his inner circle had been compromised for decades forced him to confront the possibility that every major decision of the recent past had been influenced by enemy agents whose existence he had never suspected. But the most devastating betrayal came from within the Emperor's own family rather than his administration. Malcador the Sigillite, the closest thing to a friend that the Emperor had possessed for millennia, revealed under psychic interrogation that he had been aware of growing corruption among the Primarchs for years without reporting his suspicions to his master. His justification that such intelligence would have been dismissed or ignored contained enough truth to make it impossible to condemn, but also demonstrated how completely the Emperor's emotional isolation had compromised his ability to receive vital information from those best positioned to provide it. The breakthrough that finally brought Chaos forces into the inner palace occurred when Perturbo's siege engines achieved what conventional Imperial doctrine insisted was impossible. The Iron Warriors had modified their weapons using knowledge gained through communion with daemon princes of chaos, undivided, creating artillery pieces that fired ammunition blessed by all four major chaos gods simultaneously. These hybrid projectiles proved capable of breaching defenses that had been specifically designed to resist both conventional weapons and warp-based attacks. The Emperor's response to this crisis required him to abandon the Webway barrier for the first time since Magnus's psychic breach had created the ongoing daemon incursion. This decision, forced upon him by immediate tactical necessity, unleashed horrors beneath the palace that would continue to threaten terror for the next 10,000 years. But it also freed him from the underground prison that had prevented his direct participation in the siege, allowing him to take personal command of Imperial resistance at the moment when such leadership was most desperately needed. The final phase of the siege began when Loyalist forces managed to establish contact with the approaching fleets of Lehman Russ and Lionel Johnson, whose delayed arrival had been caused by warp storms that subsequent investigation would reveal had been deliberately created by chaos sorcery. The prospect of facing fresh Loyalist legions while their own forces were depleted by months of siege warfare forced the traitor Primarchs to accelerate their timeline and attempt a final, desperate assault on the palace's remaining strongholds. It was during this climactic phase that Horus made the decision that would define the remainder of the conflict and determine the fate of both the Imperium and Chaos forces throughout the galaxy. Rather than continuing the systematic reduction of Imperial defenses, the War Master chose to lower his flagship's void shields and challenge the Emperor to single combat aboard the Vengeful Spirit. This gesture, which appeared to offer the possibility of ending the siege through personal confrontation rather than continued mass destruction, was actually the most sophisticated trap that the Chaos gods had yet devised. The decision to board the Vengeful Spirit represented the culmination of every flawed judgment that had characterized the Emperor's approach to leadership throughout the Great Crusade and its catastrophic aftermath. Despite overwhelming evidence that Horus had become something utterly alien to human nature, the Emperor clung to the desperate hope that some trace of his beloved son remained within the corrupted shell that now served as Chaos's primary weapon against Imperial civilization. The selection of companions for this final gambit revealed the Emperor's continued inability to adapt his methods to unprecedented circumstances. Rather than bringing the most tactically effective individuals available, he chose Sanguinius and Rugal Dawn based on emotional considerations that had no rational relationship to the mission's strategic requirements. This decision ensured that Terra's defense would be left leaderless at the moment when coordinated resistance was most essential to Imperial survival. The journey through the Vengeful Spirit's corrupted corridors provided the Emperor with his first direct exposure to the full scope of what Chaos corruption could achieve when given unlimited access to resources and time. The ship that had once been a monument to human engineering excellence had been transformed into something that existed partially outside normal reality, its internal geometry following rules that caused madness in unprotected minds. Each step deeper into this nightmare revealed new evidence of how completely his sons had embraced powers that he had spent millennia learning to resist and contain. The walls themselves pulsed with malevolent consciousness. The air carried whispers that promised knowledge and power in exchange for simple acknowledgement of Chaos's superiority to the Emperor's failed vision of rational enlightenment. But perhaps most disturbing were the encounters with Space Marines, whose corruption had advanced to the point where they barely retained human form. These beings who had once knelt before him in ceremonies celebrating their elevation above normal humanity now served as living demonstrations of what his genetic engineering could become when guided by entities whose understanding of biological manipulation exceeded even his vast knowledge. The discovery of Sanguinius's body marked the moment when the Emperor's last illusions about the possibility of reconciliation finally shattered. The angel had been the most pure of all his sons, the one Primarch whose nobility and compassion had remained untainted despite centuries of exposure to the galaxy's darkest conflicts. His corruption and death proved conclusively that no amount of genetic perfection or moral strength could resist chaos indefinitely when proper safeguards were absent. The examination of Sanguinius's remains revealed the sophisticated techniques that Chaos had employed to break down his psychological defenses. Rather than attacking his loyalty directly, the corruption had targeted his compassion, transforming his greatest virtue into a weapon that could be turned against everything he valued most. The process had been so gradual and subtle that even the angel himself had not recognized his transformation until it was too late to resist. This discovery forced the Emperor to confront the possibility that his entire approach to creating superhuman servants had been fundamentally flawed from the beginning. By enhancing human capabilities without providing adequate protection against warp-based corruption, he had created beings whose power made them more valuable targets for chaos recruitment rather than more effective defenders against such influence. The systematic failure of Imperial communication networks during this final phase of the crisis demonstrated how completely the Emperor's centralized command structure collapsed when his personal attention was diverted elsewhere. Without his direct oversight, the various elements of Terra's defense began operating according to contradictory priorities and obsolete intelligence. Units that should have been coordinating their efforts instead competed for resources and tactical advantages that no longer existed. The breakdown extended far beyond simple military coordination into the fundamental systems that kept Imperial civilization functioning. Supply networks that had operated flawlessly for decades suddenly failed when their administrators could not reach higher authority for guidance on handling unprecedented situations. Transportation systems ground to a halt as conflicting orders created logistical tangles that consumed more resources to resolve than they had originally required to maintain. Perhaps most damaging was the collapse of the Imperial bureaucracy's ability to maintain accurate information about the siege's progress. Reports reaching the deepest palace bunkers contradicted each other so completely that military commanders were forced to make critical decisions based on speculation rather than reliable intelligence. The fog of war that had always been a factor in large-scale conflicts became an impenetrable barrier that made coordinated resistance virtually impossible. The Emperor's prolonged absence from direct command also revealed how little his subordinates actually understood about the strategic principles that had guided Imperial expansion and defense. Orders that seemed rational when issued by an immortal being with 40,000 years of military experience became suicidal when interpreted by normal humans whose perspective was limited to their immediate tactical situation. The result was a series of cascading failures that transformed what should have been orderly withdrawal to prepared defensive positions into chaotic rout that handed critical terrain to chaos forces without significant resistance. Each tactical reverse made the next one more likely, as demoralized Imperial units lost confidence in their leadership and their ability to achieve victory against enemies who seemed to anticipate their every move. The most tragic aspect of this collapse was that many of the individual decisions made by Imperial commanders were tactically sound, given the information available to them. The system failure was structural rather than personal, caused by the Emperor's refusal to develop command structures that could function effectively without his constant intervention. The approaching loyalist fleets of Lemon Russ and Lionel Johnson, which should have represented salvation for besieged Imperial forces, instead created additional complications that further degraded Terra's defensive coordination. Neither Primarch possessed current intelligence about the siege's tactical situation, and their attempts to establish communication with palace command centers were hampered by the same network failures that were already crippling Imperial resistance. The time pressure created by their impending arrival forced Horus to accelerate his assault timeline, but it also created opportunities for tactical mistakes that more patient leadership might have avoided. The War Master's decision to lower his flagship's shields was as much a product of desperation as calculation, driven by the knowledge that continued siege warfare would eventually result in his defeat, regardless of the damage inflicted on Imperial forces. But even this apparent tactical error was actually part of a strategy so sophisticated that it required the combined intelligence of all four major chaos gods to conceive and implement. The trap being set for the Emperor was not simply military but psychological, designed to exploit his emotional attachment to his corrupted son in ways that would ensure his destruction, regardless of the confrontation's immediate outcome. As the Emperor prepared for what he believed would be a final battle to determine the fate of human civilization, he was actually walking into the most carefully orchestrated ambush in galactic history. The cascading failures that had crippled Imperial resistance were not accidental consequences of system overload, but deliberate results of manipulation that had been planned since before the first shot of the rebellion had been fired. The throne room of the vengeful spirit had been transformed into something that existed beyond the normal boundaries of physical reality. What had once been the command center of humanity's greatest warship now served as a focal point where the warp and real space intersected in ways that caused fundamental laws of physics to collapse into meaningless abstractions. The very air seemed to writhe with malevolent intelligence, carrying whispers that promised knowledge and power to any mind weak enough to listen. When the Emperor finally confronted Horus in this nightmare realm, he faced not the beloved son who had once knelt before him in ceremonies celebrating the Great Crusade's victories, but a being whose transformation had progressed so far beyond normal corruption that classification became impossible. The War Master's physical form served as a vessel for powers that represented the combined might of all four major chaos gods, creating an entity whose capabilities rivaled those of the Emperor himself. The initial moments of their confrontation revealed the depth of the trap that had been prepared for this meeting. Rather than engaging in immediate combat, Horus began speaking in a voice that carried harmonics of every conversation he had ever shared with his father. The corrupted Primarchs' words contained references to private moments that only they had experienced, demonstrating that his memories of their relationship remained intact despite his complete transformation. This psychological assault proved more devastating than any physical attack could have been. Horus spoke of the pride he had felt when first named War Master, the satisfaction that had filled him during their early campaigns together, and the gradual disillusionment that had grown as he realized his father's true nature. Each revelation was crafted to inflict maximum emotional damage while containing enough truth to make denial impossible. The Emperor's responses during these exchanges revealed a being struggling with guilt and regret that he had never previously acknowledged, even to himself. For the first time in 40 millennia, he attempted to explain decisions that had seemed obviously correct when made, but whose consequences had proven catastrophic. His justification sounded hollow even to his own ears, demonstrating how completely his isolation from normal human experience had distorted his understanding of leadership and family relationships. When combat finally began, it immediately became clear that this would not be a contest between superior and inferior beings, but a confrontation between equals whose fundamental philosophies had led them to embrace irreconcilably different approaches to power. The Emperor's attacks drew upon disciplines developed through millennia of psychic research and spiritual enlightenment. Horus countered with techniques that channeled the raw fury of the warp itself, accepting corruption as the price for capabilities that exceeded anything achievable through conventional methods. The physical destruction caused by their battle threatened the structural integrity of reality within the throne room's confines. Each psychic blast tore holes in space that revealed glimpses of realms where different physical laws applied. The clash of their weapons created energy discharges that would have vaporized normal matter, forcing both combatants to exist partially outside conventional space-time to avoid annihilation. But perhaps most terrible was the growing realization that Horus was not fighting to achieve victory in any conventional sense. His tactics were designed to prolong the confrontation rather than end it quickly, suggesting that his true objective was something other than the Emperor's immediate destruction. Each seemingly missed opportunity to land a killing blow was actually part of a strategy whose ultimate purpose remained hidden until the final moments of their struggle. The turning point came when Horus managed to inflict wounds that penetrated not just the Emperor's physical form, but his psychic essence itself. These injuries were delivered using techniques that could only have been developed through intimate knowledge of the Emperor's own capabilities and vulnerabilities. The precision required suggested that Chaos forces had been studying their ultimate enemy for far longer than anyone had suspected, possibly since before the Great Crusade had even begun. As the Emperor's strength began to fail, his perspective on the entire rebellion underwent a fundamental transformation. The recognition that his beloved son had become something utterly alien was accompanied by the understanding that his own methods had contributed directly to this corruption. The harsh treatment, the emotional distance, the refusal to trust his sons with complete knowledge of his plans, all had created the psychological vulnerabilities that Chaos had exploited so effectively. But even this moment of clarity came too late to change the battle's outcome. Horus's attacks were systematically destroying the Emperor's ability to maintain the psychic barriers that protected his consciousness from direct assault by the Chaos gods themselves. The wounds being inflicted were not simply physical damage, but fundamental alterations to his essential nature that would persist regardless of any healing that might subsequently be applied. The Emperor's final gambit required him to make a choice that violated every principle that had guided his existence since the moment of his creation. To defeat Horus, he would need to employ the same kind of absolute psychic assault that his enemy was using, accepting the risk of corruption that such methods entailed. The irony that victory might require him to become the very thing he had spent millennia fighting was not lost on his enhanced consciousness. The moment of decision came when Horus achieved what appeared to be complete victory, standing over his father's broken form while preparing to deliver the killing blow that would end the siege and secure Chaos triumph throughout the galaxy. But rather than gloating over his success, the corrupted War Master's expression contained something that might have been grief, suggesting that some fragment of his original personality remained aware of what he was about to destroy. It was this glimpse of his lost son that finally broke through the Emperor's reluctance to use his full power. The recognition that Horus was suffering even as he served as Chaos's primary weapon provided the emotional catalyst needed to overcome decades of restraint and unleash psychic forces that the Emperor had kept carefully controlled since the early days of his existence. The psychic assault that followed was not simply an attack, but a complete rewriting of local reality that eliminated Horus's consciousness so thoroughly that not even the Chaos gods could preserve any trace of his essence. But this absolute victory came at a price that would haunt the Emperor for the next 10,000 years. In destroying his son so completely, he had been forced to employ methods that fundamentally altered his own nature, ensuring that he could never again be the being he had been before this final confrontation. The War Master's death sent shockwaves through the warp that were felt by every psyker in the galaxy. Chaos forces throughout the Sol system suddenly found themselves cut off from the source of power that had sustained their assault on Terra. The rebellion that had seemed on the verge of total victory began to collapse as its supernatural foundations crumbled along with their primary champion. But even as loyalist forces began to push back against the suddenly weakened traitor armies, the Emperor lay dying from wounds that no amount of medical intervention could heal. The victory that had seemed to save human civilization had cost the one being whose survival was essential to maintaining the Empire. He had built the irony that success and failure had become indistinguishable, would define the next 10 millennia of human history. The Emperor's placement upon the Golden Throne represented the most desperate improvisation in Imperial history, a technological solution to a problem that transcended the boundaries of conventional science. The life support systems that had originally been designed to sustain a single consciousness during brief psychic projections were hastily modified to maintain the dying God Emperor's existence indefinitely, despite clear evidence that such usage would require sacrifices that no rational civilization should have been willing to make. The immediate aftermath of Horus's death revealed how completely the Emperor's centralized leadership had undermined the Imperium's capacity for independent governance. Without his direct guidance, the various elements of imperial administration began operating according to contradictory priorities and obsolete doctrines. Military commanders who had spent centuries following explicit orders found themselves paralyzed by the need to make strategic decisions without access to the superhuman intelligence that had previously coordinated all major operations. Rogel Dawn's assumption of temporary authority provided essential continuity during the most critical phase of the transition. But his background as a siege warfare specialist had not prepared him for the complexities of governing a galaxy-spanning civilization. His initial orders reflected a military mindset that treated every administrative challenge as a tactical problem to be solved through the application of superior force and unwavering discipline. The Codex Astartes, developed by Robert Guilliman during this period of emergency governance, represented both the most successful and most destructive reform implemented in the immediate post-heresy period. The systematic division of the Space Marine legions into smaller, more manageable chapters eliminated the possibility of another rebellion on the scale that Horus had orchestrated. But it also destroyed military formations that had been specifically designed to handle galaxy-spanning threats, leaving humanity vulnerable to exactly the kind of existential dangers that the original legions had been created to combat. The logic behind this restructuring was unassailable from the perspective of preventing future civil wars, but it reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of why the rebellion had occurred in the first place. Rather than addressing the psychological and spiritual factors that had made the Primarchs vulnerable to chaos corruption, The Codex focused on limiting the damage that future betrayals could cause. This approach ensured that the underlying problems would persist while reducing the Imperium's capacity to respond effectively when they inevitably manifested again. The establishment of the High Lords of Terror as the Emperor's governing council created an administrative structure that was designed to prevent any single individual from accumulating enough power to threaten imperial unity. But this system also ensured that future governance would be characterized by bureaucratic paralysis, rather than the decisive action that had defined the Great Crusade. Each major decision now required consensus among officials whose primary qualification was their ability to navigate political conflicts rather than their expertise in the areas they administered. The rise of the imperial cult during this period represented perhaps the most profound betrayal of everything the emperor had claimed to value throughout his existence. The being who had spent millennia fighting against religious superstition was transformed into the central deity of the most fanatically religious civilization in galactic history. This transformation was not imposed by external enemies, but embraced by his own followers, who found spiritual comfort in worshipping their creator, despite his explicit prohibition of such practices. The theological implications of this development were staggering in their irony. The imperial truth that had proclaimed gods to be primitive delusions was replaced by a doctrine that treated the emperor as the one true divinity whose worship was essential to human salvation. The secular paradise that had been promised to those who embraced rational enlightenment became a theocracy whose brutality exceeded anything achieved by the religious civilizations that imperial doctrine had claimed to supersede. But perhaps most damaging was the impact that this transformation had on the emperor's own consciousness as he lay suspended between life and death on the golden throne. The psychic emanations of trillions of worshippers gradually began to alter his essential nature, forcing him to become the god that his followers believed him to be, rather than the rational being he had chosen to remain. This slow transformation represented a form of corruption that was in some ways more complete than anything Chaos had achieved, turning his greatest victory into a prison that grew stronger with each passing century. The great scouring that followed the Siege of Terror demonstrated how quickly the Imperium's military capabilities degraded once the unifying influence of the Emperor's direct leadership was removed. What should have been a systematic campaign to eliminate remaining Chaos forces devolved into a series of uncoordinated vengeance raids that consumed enormous resources while achieving minimal strategic objectives. Each loyal Primarch approached the task of pursuing traitor forces according to his own psychological needs rather than any coherent strategic plan. The Iron Hands sought to prove their loyalty through displays of ruthlessness that exceeded even their previous standards. The Imperial Fists fortified positions that had no strategic value simply because Dawn found comfort in construction projects that reminded him of more optimistic times. The Space Wolves hunted individual targets with an intensity that ignored larger tactical considerations. The result was a campaign that eliminated many dangerous enemies, but failed to address the fundamental problems that had made the heresy possible in the first place. Chaos cults continued to operate throughout Imperial space, hidden among populations that had been given no spiritual alternative to fill the void left by the collapse of secular rationalism. The traitor legions that escaped into the Eye of Terror retained their organizational structure and combat effectiveness, ensuring that they would continue to pose existential threats to Imperial civilization for millennia to come. The technological regression that began during this period represented one of the most catastrophic long-term consequences of the Emperor's approach to governance. His policy of concentrating advanced knowledge among a small number of trusted specialists had left the Imperium vulnerable to exactly the kind of expertise loss that massive casualties inevitably produced. The death or corruption of key personnel during the heresy eliminated understanding of technologies that could not be replaced through conventional research and development. The Mechanicum's response to this crisis established patterns of technological stagnation that would define Imperial civilization for the next 10,000 years. Rather than attempting to recreate lost knowledge through experimentation and innovation, the tech priests chose to treat surviving technologies as sacred relics whose operation required religious devotion rather than scientific understanding. This approach preserved some capabilities that might otherwise have been lost entirely, but it also ensured that future technological development would be impossible. The Emperor's daily agony on the Golden Throne, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psykers each day, created a moral paradox that undermined every principle the Imperium claimed to represent. The civilization that had been founded on the promise of human dignity and rational progress now survived through systematic human sacrifice on a scale that dwarfed the worst excesses of the religious civilizations it had replaced. The irony that this practice was justified through devotion to a being who would have been horrified by such methods was lost on the administrators who implemented and maintained the system. 10 millennia after the Emperor's entombment upon the Golden Throne, the Imperium that bears his name has become a monument to the failure of every principle he once claimed to champion. The rational civilization he envisioned has devolved into a superstitious nightmare where knowledge is treated as heresy and progress is regarded as a form of blasphemy against divine will. The secular paradise promised to those who embraced the imperial truth has been replaced by a theocracy whose brutality would have shocked even the most fanatical religious zealots of the pre-imperial era. The technological regression that began in the immediate aftermath of the heresy has continued unabated throughout the subsequent centuries, transforming humanity from a species capable of creating wonders that bordered on the miraculous into scavengers who worshipped the remnants of their ancestors' achievements without understanding the principles that made such creations possible. Standard template constructs that once enabled rapid colonization and development across the galaxy have become religious artifacts whose activation requires elaborate rituals rather than simple technical knowledge. The Space Marine chapters that replaced the original legions have evolved into monastic orders whose primary function is the preservation of combat traditions rather than the protection of human civilians. These warriors, created using genetic templates derived from the Emperor's own sons, now serve an empire that routinely sacrifices billions of its citizens to maintain systems that their creator would have considered abominations. The irony that his greatest military achievement has become the enforcement arm of everything he fought to eliminate represents perhaps the most complete betrayal of his original vision. The Adeptus Mechanicus, whose knowledge was once essential to imperial expansion and technological advancement, has transformed into a cult that treats innovation as a form of heresy, punishable by death. The quest for knowledge that once drove their exploration of the galaxy's mysteries has been replaced by ritualistic worship of existing machines whose operation is maintained through prayer rather than understanding. This deliberate ignorance has left humanity vulnerable to technological failures that could have been easily prevented through basic maintenance and repair procedures. The Inquisition, originally conceived as a safeguard against the kind of corruption that had enabled the Horus Heresy, has become an organization whose paranoia exceeds even the most extreme examples of totalitarian oppression in human history. Their authority to declare entire planets heretical and order their destruction has been used so frequently that the cure has become more destructive than the disease they were created to combat. Worlds that might have been saved through education and reform are instead subjected to exterminatus, eliminating billions of potentially loyal citizens to prevent the spread of corruption that might have been contained through less drastic measures. The Emperor's continued existence on the Golden Throne has created a theological paradox that torments both him and his worshippers. His consciousness, sustained by constant agony and the daily sacrifice of innocent psykers, has been gradually transformed by 10 millennia of prayer and devotion into something that resembles the gods he once denied. This unwilling apotheosis represents a form of corruption more complete than anything Chaos achieved during the heresy, turning his greatest philosophical principle into the foundation of his eternal torment. The psychic emanations generated by trillions of worshippers across the galaxy have begun to manifest phenomena that blur the distinction between the Emperor's will and the kind of supernatural intervention that imperial doctrine attributes to divine power. Saints whose actions seem to channel his direct intervention appear during moments of crisis, performing miracles that would have been impossible without access to warp-based abilities that the imperial truth had forbidden. These manifestations provide hope to imperial citizens while simultaneously proving that everything their society officially believes about the nature of reality is fundamentally false. The daemon Primarchs, who escaped into the Eye of Terror during the Great Scouring, have become living monuments to the Emperor's failure as both father and strategist. Each of these corrupted beings represents not just a military threat to imperial civilization, but a personal reminder of relationships that might have been salvaged through different choices during the Great Crusade. Their periodic incursions into real space serve as demonstrations that the rebellion's underlying causes were never addressed, only temporarily suppressed through superior force. Angron's transformation into a daemon prince of Khorne completed a corruption that began when the Emperor abandoned his gladiator brothers to die on Nuceria. The World Eater's systematic descent into mindless violence fulfilled the worst possibilities inherent in their genetic programming, creating warriors whose only purpose is the generation of bloodshed for its own sake. The legion that might have been the Imperium's most effective shock troops has become a weapon that destroys everything it touches, including the very populations it was created to protect. Mortarion's embrace of Nurgle's gifts represents the inevitable conclusion of resentment that festered for centuries after his humiliation on Barbarus. The Death Guard's transformation into harbingers of galactic plague ensures that their very presence spreads corruption that can never be entirely eliminated. Worlds that successfully repel their attacks remain contaminated by diseases that continue to claim lives long after the immediate military threat has ended. The loss of Magnus the Red to Tsainch eliminated the psychic expertise that might have provided protection against the very sorcery that the Council of Nikaea had been convened to address. The Thousand Suns' descent into dust-animated automata serves as a grotesque parody of the immortality that their Primarch had once sought to achieve through legitimate research. Their continued existence as pawns of the Changer of Ways demonstrates how completely the Emperor's harsh treatment of psychic development had backfired. The Emperor's isolation from normal human experience, which had been a factor in his poor relationships with the Primarchs, has only intensified during his millennia of entombment. His consciousness exists in a state of constant pain that makes meaningful communication with his subjects virtually impossible. The rare occasions when his will is transmitted through the Astronomicon or manifested through Imperial saints provide guidance that is often cryptic and contradictory, reflecting a mind that has been driven to the edge of madness by 10,000 years of unending torment. The bureaucratic paralysis that characterizes imperial governance represents the logical endpoint of administrative systems designed by beings who understood warfare but had no experience with the complexities of civilian administration. Each crisis requires approval from multiple overlapping authorities whose jurisdictions were never clearly defined, ensuring that responses to urgent situations are delayed until they become catastrophic. The result is an empire that consistently fails to address problems until they have grown beyond any possibility of effective solution. The spiritual void that the imperial truth created by denying the reality of supernatural forces has been filled not by rational enlightenment, but by the most primitive forms of religious fanaticism. Citizens who might have been educated to resist chaos corruption through understanding are instead left defenseless against temptations. They have been taught not to recognize. The imperial cult's promise of salvation through faith provides comfort to billions, while simultaneously making them vulnerable to exactly the kind of spiritual manipulation that proper education might have prevented. Perhaps most tragic of all is the recognition that many of the Imperium's current problems could still be solved if the Emperor were capable of providing the kind of decisive leadership that had characterized the Great Crusade. But his entombment has transformed him from an active participant in human affairs into a passive observer whose greatest acts of will are required simply to maintain his own existence. The being who once reshaped the galaxy according to his vision now struggles to maintain the minimal psychic barriers that prevent terror from being consumed by daemonic incursion. In the deepest archives of the Inquisition, sealed behind wards that would drive lesser minds to madness, lie reports that suggest the Emperor's greatest mistake may still be ahead of us. These documents, classified at levels that require the unanimous consent of all High Lords of Terror to access, contain evidence of phenomena that challenge every assumption about the Master of Mankind's current state and future intentions. The most disturbing of these accounts describe incidents where the Emperor's psychic emanations have begun to exhibit patterns that mirror the very chaos corruption he spent millennia fighting to contain. Imperial saints, whose actions once provided hope and inspiration to loyal citizens, now sometimes manifest abilities that bear uncomfortable similarities to demonic possession. Miracles performed in his name occasionally leave behind after effects that resemble the kind of warp taint that inquisitors are trained to purge with extreme prejudice. These anomalies have led some of the Imperium's most learned theologians to propose theories that would horrify ordinary Imperial citizens if they were ever made public. The possibility that 10,000 years of worship by trillions of souls has begun to transform the Emperor into the very type of warp entity he once opposed represents a form of corruption more complete than anything chaos achieved during the Horus Heresy. The evidence supporting this hypothesis extends beyond simple theological speculation into verifiable psychological and psychic phenomena. Astropaths who maintain direct communication with the Astronomicon report experiencing visions that grow more alien and incomprehensible with each passing year. The Emperor's guidance, once provided through concepts that could be translated into human language, now arrives as impressions that resist interpretation by minds limited to conventional reality. More troubling still are the reports from tech priests who maintain the Golden Throne's increasingly unstable systems. The ancient machinery that sustains the Emperor's existence has begun manifesting properties that cannot be explained through any known principles of Imperial technology. Components that should have failed millennia ago continue to function through what can only be described as supernatural intervention, while new growths of quasi-organic material appear throughout the throne's structure without any apparent source or purpose. These biological manifestations have been subjected to every form of analysis that Imperial science can provide, but their nature continues to defy classification. They appear to be neither fully organic nor entirely mechanical, existing in a state that bridges the gap between conventional matter and warp essence. More disturbing is their apparent responsiveness to the Emperor's mental state, growing more elaborate during periods when his psychic emanations suggest increased agitation or distress. The implications of these developments extend far beyond simple theological curiosity into questions of fundamental Imperial policy. If the Emperor is indeed undergoing transformation into a warp entity, the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psykers may not be sustaining his human consciousness, but accelerating his metamorphosis into something utterly alien to the species he was created to protect. Recent incidents involving the Legion of the Damned have provided additional evidence that the Emperor's relationship with normal reality has begun to deteriorate in ways that even his most devoted followers find deeply unsettling. These spectral space marines appear during moments of extreme crisis, fighting with capabilities that exceed anything achievable through conventional enhancement. But their manifestations are accompanied by phenomena that suggest they exist partially outside normal space-time, raising questions about whether their intervention represents salvation or something far more ominous. The timing of these appearances has begun to follow patterns that indicate conscious intelligence rather than simple response to Imperial need. The Legion manifests not just during military crises, but specifically during moments when Imperial forces face enemies that employ tactics or technologies derived from the Emperor's own innovations. This suggests that his consciousness retains detailed awareness of current events despite his apparent isolation on the Golden Throne, but also that his responses to these situations have become increasingly alien to normal human reasoning. Perhaps most disturbing are the reports from worlds that have experienced direct intervention by entities claiming to represent the Emperor's will. These beings, which imperial doctrine classifies as living saints, possess capabilities that border on the divine but demonstrate moral perspectives that would have been utterly alien to the rational secularist who founded the Imperium. Their solutions to local crises often involve levels of violence and transformation that exceed even the Inquisition's normally extreme standards. The theological implications of these manifestations have created schisms within the imperial cult that threaten to tear the organization apart from within. Traditional believers maintain that any action taken in the Emperor's name must be inherently righteous, regardless of its apparent brutality. But a growing minority of theologians argue that the being currently manifesting through these saints may no longer be the same entity who sacrificed himself to save humanity during the Horus Heresy. This debate has been complicated by the discovery of prophetic texts that predate the Emperor's entombment by several millennia. These documents, found in archaeological sites scattered across the galaxy, contain descriptions of a golden god whose transformation into something monstrous would herald the end of human civilization as it currently exists. The accuracy of their descriptions of current imperial conditions has forced even the most skeptical inquisitors to consider the possibility that the Emperor's apotheosis was planned by entities whose understanding of temporal causality transcends normal comprehension. The most classified of these prophecies describe a final awakening in which the Emperor's accumulated divine power would be unleashed in a psychic storm that would reshape the galaxy according to his transformed will, rather than restoring the secular paradise of the Great Crusade. This event would create a reality where the distinction between the material universe and the warp would cease to exist. Humanity would achieve the psychic evolution that he had always intended, but at the cost of everything that had previously defined human nature. Current analysis of the Golden Throne's deteriorating condition suggests that such an awakening may be approaching, whether or not it represents the Emperor's conscious intention. The ancient machinery that binds his consciousness to his physical form has begun exhibiting failure patterns that indicate complete system collapse within the next few centuries. When that moment arrives, the accumulated psychic energy of 10,000 years of worship and sacrifice will be released in ways that no amount of preparation can control or contain. The preparations being made by various imperial factions for this approaching crisis reveal how completely the Emperor's original vision has been corrupted by the civilization that claims to serve his will. Rather than seeking to prevent his transformation or restore him to his original nature, most organizations are positioning themselves to benefit from the new reality that his apotheosis would create. The Imperium that was founded on the promise of human dignity and rational progress is preparing to sacrifice both in exchange for the raw power that divine transformation would provide. But perhaps most tragic of all is the evidence suggesting that the Emperor himself remains aware of what he is becoming and is powerless to prevent the transformation that his own survival has made inevitable. The psychic emanations that reach Terra's surface during moments of extreme distress carry impressions of a consciousness trapped within a form that grows more alien with each passing day. The being who once sought to elevate humanity to its highest potential has become a prisoner of his own apotheosis, watching helplessly as his gradual metamorphosis into a god destroys everything he fought to protect. In the grim darkness of the far future, The master of mankind's greatest mistake may not be any single decision he made during his mortal existence, but his survival itself. The Emperor's refusal to accept death and his determination to continue guiding humanity despite his physical destruction has created a situation where his love for his species has become the instrument of its ultimate corruption. And in the deepest vaults beneath the imperial palace, where the golden throne pulses with the power of a dying god, there are whispers that suggest he knows this truth better than anyone else. The greatest tragedy of the 41st millennium may not be that the Emperor failed to save humanity, but that his success in preserving human civilization has doomed it to a fate worse than anything chaos could have devised. The golden dream of unity and enlightenment has become an eternal nightmare from which neither the Emperor nor his subjects can ever awaken. And perhaps, in that terrible recognition, lies the ultimate truth about the price of salvation in a universe where even the most noble intentions can become the foundation of infinite damnation.